They always say you can never truly know someone, not even your own family. But what if the person you trusted most, your own child, became the source of your ultimate nightmare? This is the question that now haunts Hollywood, Brentwood, and the world at large. The Reiner family, one of the most celebrated and respected households in film and activism, has been ripped apart by a tragedy so shocking, so unimaginable, that it feels like a story ripped straight from a crime thriller. Yet, this was no movie script. It was real life, and it all unfolded over the course of a single, tragic weekend. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, in a serene, upscale neighborhood of Brentwood, Los Angeles, police responded to a call that would send shockwaves across the city and the entertainment industry. The bodies of Rob Reiner, the acclaimed filmmaker and political activist, and his wife Michelle Reiner, a talented photographer and producer, were discovered in their home. The circumstances were immediately horrifying. Both had been fatally stabbed. The world watched in disbelief as the idyllic image of this Hollywood family, a picture of success, love, and cultural influence, crumbled into chaos. But the real shock, the part that nobody saw coming, was the name linked to the crime. Nick Reiner, the couple's younger son, a 32-year-old man who had grown up in the limelight yet largely out of the public eye, was arrested within hours. Taken into custody without incident at a park near the University of Southern California, Nick became the face of a tragedy that would dominate headlines, social media feeds, and late-night news commentary. How could a son commit such an act against his own parents? And what drove him to a point of no return? To understand this, we have to step back. Rob Reiner, at 78, was not just a Hollywood legend. He was a symbol of activism and creative integrity. Known for his work on iconic films, his voice extended far beyond cinema. He spoke on politics, social justice, and community, earning accolades not only for his craft, but also for his unwavering principles. Michelle Reiner, at 70, complemented his influence with her own artistic contributions, capturing images and producing work that resonated in the worlds of art and media. Together, they represented a legacy, a dynasty rooted in creativity, intellect, and public service. Yet even within the most seemingly perfect families, shadows can linger. Observers are quick to judge the rich and famous, assuming that wealth and status shield individuals from real human strife. But wealth can hide tension, privilege can mask mental health struggles, and fame can obscure the cracks forming behind closed doors. The Reiners, despite their accomplishments and public image, were not immune. And Nick, the youngest in the family, had a story that was far more complicated than headlines suggested. Nick Reiner grew up surrounded by celebrity, raised in a household that valued achievement and visibility. Friends and acquaintances described him as intelligent and introspective, but also as someone who struggled quietly, someone whose personal challenges were largely invisible to the outside world. Unlike his older siblings, Nick maintained a lower profile, rarely courting the press, rarely attending high-profile events. But beneath that quiet exterior, sources suggest there were growing tensions, undercurrents of resentment, and possibly struggles with identity and autonomy. What exactly pushed him to this horrifying act is a question investigators, psychologists, and the public are desperately seeking to answer. The scene at the Brentwood home was immediately chaotic. Emergency responders spoke of a house transformed from a sanctuary into a crime scene. Police cordoned off the area, neighbors watched in disbelief, and the media descended in full force. Headlines flashed the name Nick Reiner across every major outlet. Social media erupted with speculation, outrage, and heartbreak. How could this happen in a family celebrated for its accomplishments, its cultural influence, and its public image of stability and love? Within hours, law enforcement had pieced together a timeline. It was a race against the clock, a meticulous gathering of evidence that led directly to Nick. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic data converged, resulting in an arrest that would stun both Hollywood and the nation. Taken into custody in a calm but firm operation, Nick Reiner's arrest was a shocking confirmation of every parent's worst fear, that the person you love and raised could become the agent of unimaginable tragedy. But there was more to the story than a straightforward arrest. Even in those first hours, whispers of family complexities began to circulate. Was this a crime of premeditation? Were there financial motives, mental health issues, or unresolved familial conflicts? Questions about inheritance, personal grievances, and prior incidents began surfacing. Friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the public persona of Nick with the actions he had allegedly taken. How could someone raised with love, privilege, and access to every opportunity reach a point of such darkness? The public reaction was instantaneous. Social media feeds filled with shock, disbelief, and debate. Hollywood insiders, who knew the Reiners personally or professionally, expressed horror and confusion. Headlines across the globe read variations of "Tragedy in Brentwood," "Nick Reiner arrested," and "Hollywood's perfect family shattered." The dichotomy of image versus reality became glaringly evident. The Reiner legacy, once celebrated and revered, was now entangled in a story of murder, betrayal, and familial collapse. Even as the arrest unfolded, law enforcement remained tight-lipped about the specifics, citing ongoing investigations and the need to protect the integrity of the case. Yet fragments leaked. Police confirmed first-degree murder charges, a chilling indicator of intent. Media analysts and legal experts began dissecting what first-degree murder implied. The possibility that this was a planned act, not a momentary lapse of reason or emotion. The narrative became even more haunting. A son, allegedly plotting against his parents, in a family admired by millions. And yet, in the midst of this horror, human curiosity and empathy collided. How did Nick get here? Was there a breaking point, a moment when years of suppressed emotion and unaddressed struggles erupted? Or was this a calculated act driven by other motives entirely? Experts on family dynamics, psychologists, and criminal behavior analysts began weighing in, each theory more unsettling than the last. The public was left with only fragments, assembling their own understanding from headlines, social media speculation, and official statements. This tragedy also illuminated a deeper cultural fascination. Why are we drawn to stories of wealthy, famous families unraveling in violence? Perhaps it's the contrast, the collision of privilege and horror, of glamour and betrayal. The Reiners were a mirror, reflecting both the aspirations and anxieties of society at large. People could see that even those who seem untouchable are vulnerable, that wealth does not immunize against mental health struggles, family conflict, or tragedy. The story forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in homes bathed in sunlight, success, and fame. As the hours turned into days, the media coverage intensified. Rob and Michelle Reiner's careers, accolades, and contributions were revisited, creating a stark juxtaposition. A lifetime of public respect overshadowed by a weekend of private horror. Friends and colleagues shared memories of kindness, humor, and mentorship. Yet each recollection was tinged with disbelief, as they grappled with the unimaginable, that the heart of this tragedy was allegedly Nick himself. How could this narrative exist without contradictions, without twists that would keep everyone questioning reality? And then there was the legal dimension. With first-degree murder charges, Nick faced a future that was grim and public. Legal analysts began outlining possible sentences, courtroom strategies, and the intense media scrutiny that would accompany every step. The trial would not be a quiet affair. It would be a spectacle, a moment where family, justice, and public fascination collided. It was a narrative no one could ignore, a story unfolding in real time with stakes beyond imagination. The Reiner tragedy is also a story about perception versus reality, about the hidden struggles that can fester behind closed doors. As we examine the life of Nick Reiner, the son, the student, the heir to a legacy, we are confronted with questions that linger long after headlines fade. How do family dynamics, mental health, and unresolved conflict intersect to create disaster? Could this have been prevented? And what does this story tell us about the pressures and invisibilities within families, even those lauded as perfect? But here's the most chilling part. Even now, as we recount the events, the questions outnumber the answers. Investigators continue to uncover evidence, journalists continue to dig, and public speculation continues to swirl. Every new detail adds layers of complexity, new contradictions, and new emotional beats. It is a story of horror, but also of human fragility, of the tenuous bonds that hold families together. And just when you think you understand the narrative, another twist emerges, leaving you questioning everything you thought you knew. This introduction sets the stage for a journey into one of Hollywood's most shocking tragedies, a story that combines fame, family, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of a son's alleged actions against his own parents. We will explore the crime scene, the investigation, the possible motives, and the ripple effects on the Reiner legacy, as well as the emotional fallout for everyone involved. Along the way, we'll delve into the secrets that may have been hidden, the contradictions that confound, and the questions that remain hauntingly unanswered. And so we begin. The Reiner tragedy is more than a story of crime. It is a story of human complexity, of the thin line between love and destruction, and of the shocking reality that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you trust most. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered how quickly a life can be ripped apart? How? In just a matter of hours, a neighborhood can go from serene normalcy to a place of disbelief and horror. That's exactly what happened on a seemingly ordinary Sunday afternoon in Brentwood, Los Angeles, a place known for its manicured streets, luxury cars, and Hollywood glamour. But behind one elegant gate, inside one of the city's most respected homes, a tragedy was unfolding that would shock the world. It was Sunday, early afternoon. Sunlight streamed over the hills of Brentwood, birds chirped, and neighbors went about their usual routines. Dog walkers pacing the streets, children playing, and gardeners tending to their lush lawns. For the residents, it was a perfect day, the kind you might capture in a photograph and pin on a fridge. But inside the Reiner household, an unimaginable horror had already begun. The first call to emergency services came from someone close to the family. Details remained tightly controlled by law enforcement, but early reports indicate that someone had tried to reach Rob or Michelle and received no response. Concern turned to dread when the emergency team entered the Brentwood mansion. The scene they encountered was nothing short of catastrophic. Both Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Reiner, 70, had been fatally stabbed. The home, once a sanctuary of art, love, and laughter, was now a crime scene, filled with the weight of death and the silence that only tragedy can bring. The response was immediate and intense. Police vehicles lined the street, lights flashing, cameras capturing the moment. The world was watching, even if they didn't yet know the names or faces involved. Local news helicopters hovered over the neighborhood. Within hours, the story spread across the globe, and social media exploded. Every detail that could be confirmed, and even some that couldn't, was dissected, shared, and debated. But the shock wasn't only in the deaths themselves. It was the speed with which law enforcement traced the crime to a suspect nobody expected, Nick Reiner, the couple's 32-year-old son. Within hours of the bodies being discovered, Nick had been located at a park near the University of Southern California. Taken into custody without incident, he became the epicenter of a media storm that no one, not even seasoned Hollywood journalists, could have predicted. Think about that for a moment. How does a son, someone raised with love, privilege, and every opportunity imaginable, become the alleged perpetrator of a double homicide against his own parents? What forces, internal, external, or perhaps both, could drive someone to such extremes? This was the question gripping not only Brentwood but the entire nation. The timeline of that Sunday is both meticulous and chilling. Investigators later pieced together the hours leading up to the discovery. It's unclear exactly when the altercation began, or what conversations, if any, preceded the tragedy. But by the early afternoon, the couple was found lifeless. Friends and neighbors reported a sense of unease, sensing that something was profoundly wrong. Within mere hours, surveillance footage and witness accounts pointed to Nick, culminating in his arrest in the early evening. From the outside looking in, this was a perfect storm, a Hollywood household, a tragedy of unparalleled emotional weight, and a suspect whose identity seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the image of a loving son. People asked themselves, and still ask, how the narrative could make any sense. Law enforcement officials have been careful with details, citing the integrity of the investigation. but the fragments that emerged painted a complex picture. First-degree murder charges indicated a level of intent that made the tragedy even more incomprehensible. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It suggested planning, premeditation, and a motive that the world would scramble to understand. As the story unfolded, neighbors described a community in shock. Brentwood, known for its quiet streets and affluence, had never witnessed something like this. People who waved hello to the Reiners or spotted them at local cafes now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Could such violence exist in a neighborhood so meticulously curated, so carefully preserved? And what of the Reiner legacy, so publicly celebrated, now entwined with a narrative of horror? Even friends and colleagues of the family expressed disbelief. Rob Reiner, whose films like This Is Spinal Tap and A Few Good Men shaped Hollywood for decades, was widely respected for both his artistic vision and his activism. Michelle Reiner, equally accomplished, had influenced the creative world behind the camera, often unrecognized by mainstream audiences. Together, they were seen as a powerful duo, a family to admire, perhaps even envy. And yet, all of that recognition and reverence could not prevent the horror that would erupt within the walls of their own home. Nick Reiner, the youngest, had always maintained a lower profile than his parents or any siblings. He was not a Hollywood fixture. He didn't attend premieres or political galas. To the public, he was largely invisible, which made the news of his arrest all the more jarring. The contrast between his quiet existence and the extreme action attributed to him created a tension that journalists and analysts would explore endlessly. Could the pressures of fame, the weight of expectation, or private family conflicts have pushed him to a breaking point? Or was there something else, something deeper and more calculated, that led to this tragic day? Within hours, the story became a case study in contradictions. A household known for love and accomplishment, a son whose upbringing promised opportunity, and a crime that defied comprehension. Headlines screamed, social media roared, and the world struggled to reconcile the image of the Reiner family with the grim reality that had just been revealed. But it wasn't just the immediate shock that captured public attention. It was the way the narrative began to unravel, layer by layer, with each detail adding complexity, tension, and emotional weight. Every neighbor interview, every snippet of surveillance footage, every statement from friends or colleagues introduced new questions and new contradictions. How could a loving household harbor the darkness that led to this event? What were the early warning signs, if any, and who could have seen this coming? Even the media coverage itself became part of the story. Journalists speculated, experts weighed in, and armchair detectives dissected every possible motive. Each new revelation. A detail about Nick's history, a comment from a family friend, a leaked document, became a piece in a puzzle no one could fully complete. And as each piece was added, the shock deepened. We also have to consider the psychological dimension. Family psychologists and criminal behavior experts later examined the situation, discussing how underlying tensions, mental health issues, or unresolved conflicts could create the conditions for such a tragedy. These insights, while hypothetical, painted a chilling portrait. A son overwhelmed by internal and external pressures, a household with dynamics that were perhaps misunderstood or ignored, and a series of choices that culminated in an irreversible act. As law enforcement continued to gather evidence, the story took on a life of its own. It was no longer just about crime. It became about human complexity, the fragility of relationships, and the stark contrast between public perception and private reality. How could the world reconcile a legacy built over decades with a single, horrifying act? How could fame and influence intersect with tragedy in a way that left everyone questioning morality, loyalty, and human behavior? And yet, even in this chaos, a strange fascination gripped the public. People were drawn not only to the crime itself, but to the human story beneath it. What was it like to grow up in the shadow of Hollywood fame, surrounded by brilliance, privilege, and expectation? How does one navigate the pressures of legacy while struggling with personal challenges? And most importantly, how does a family, any family, confront the unimaginable reality that one of their own has allegedly committed such a violent act? The day that the Reiners were found dead was more than just a crime scene. It was a catalyst for discussion, speculation, and reflection. It was the beginning of a saga that would dominate headlines, dominate conversations, and dominate the consciousness of anyone who had ever believed that success and love could protect a family from tragedy. The day everything changed was not just a day in Brentwood. It was a day that shattered perceptions, challenged assumptions, and left a community and a world grappling for understanding. And as authorities continued their investigation, uncovering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together the timeline of events, it became clear that the story was far from over. There were layers yet to be revealed, secrets still hidden, and questions that would haunt the public for months, perhaps years. Rob and Michelle were also parents who nurtured their children's talents. Friends and insiders speak of the care and attention they devoted to Nick and any siblings. They encouraged creativity, supported educational pursuits, and provided opportunities that most could only dream of. And yet, it's possible for parental support, however well-intentioned, to feel suffocating or inadequate to a child who is struggling internally. Could the combination of high expectations and a desire for individuality have created pressure points that no one could see? The public response to the tragedy was immediate and intense. Celebrities who had known the Reiners shared memories and condolences, painting a picture of a family that had touched countless lives. Social media exploded with speculation, sorrow, and disbelief. Headlines highlighted Rob's career, Michelle's accomplishments, and the shocking fact that their son was allegedly involved. The contrast between public admiration and private horror was stark, a duality that made the story irresistible to both journalists and the public. Even within the entertainment industry, the reaction was a mixture of grief and confusion. How could a family so successful, so intelligent, so seemingly cohesive, end up in such catastrophic circumstances? The narrative challenged assumptions about privilege, love, and loyalty. It reminded the world that no amount of fame or fortune could shield a family from tragedy. And it raised uncomfortable questions about the pressures faced by children of high-profile parents. Consider for a moment the paradox of the Reiners' situation. On one hand, they were admired globally. On the other, they became the epicenter of one of Hollywood's most shocking family tragedies. The duality is almost cinematic. A storyline that seems too dramatic for fiction, yet the events were horrifyingly real. And as the investigation unfolded, the layers of this story grew more complex, more emotionally charged, and more difficult to reconcile with the image of the Reiners that the world had long celebrated. Inside the Reiner household, the dynamic was complicated. Sources describe moments of warmth, laughter, and mentorship. There were family traditions, artistic collaborations, and shared achievements. Yet, like many families, there were also disagreements, unspoken resentments, and conflicts that never reached the public eye. It's within this tension, this interplay of love and friction, that the seeds of tragedy may have quietly taken root. Nick, as the youngest son, existed in the shadow of his parents' brilliance and the expectations that came with it. While he had opportunities and support, he also faced pressures that were invisible to outsiders. Personal struggles, identity crises, and the desire for autonomy can weigh heavily on anyone, especially when magnified by public perception and family expectations. Did Nick feel trapped? Did he harbor frustration or anger that went unrecognized? These questions remain central to understanding the trajectory that led to that tragic Sunday. In addition to familial dynamics, there were other external pressures. Rob's activism and public stances occasionally drew criticism, media scrutiny, and controversy. Navigating public attention while maintaining private family life is never easy, and the Reiners were no exception. This constant balancing act may have created subtle stresses within the household, stresses that the public could never see, but that may have influenced personal relationships over time. The Reiners were, in many ways, a microcosm of the pressures facing any high-achieving family, amplified by fame and scrutiny. They had influence, opportunity, and recognition, yet these very factors created a complex environment for the children growing up in their home. Expectations, identity formation, and the search for independence are challenging in any household. But in the Reiners' case, the stakes were magnified by their public personas. And then came the day that shattered it all. The facade of perfection crumbled under the weight of a single act that no one saw coming. It forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about families, privilege, and the hidden struggles that can lurk beneath even the most polished exteriors. The story of the Reiners is a reminder that human complexity, family dynamics, and personal struggles often exist behind the scenes, unseen and unresolved, until tragedy strikes. As we reflect on Rob and Michelle Reiner's lives, it becomes clear that this is a story not only about fame or Hollywood legacy, but about the universal tensions that exist within families. Love, expectation, pressure, and individuality. All of these forces collided in ways that had catastrophic consequences. And as investigators continue to piece together the details, we are left with a lingering question. How did this household, celebrated for so long, end up at the center of one of the most shocking family tragedies in recent memory? The Reiners were more than their deaths. They were creators, thinkers, mentors, and parents who left a mark on the world. And yet, their legacy is now intertwined with a story of betrayal, loss, and heartbreak. A story that forces us to look deeper, ask harder questions, and confront the uncomfortable realities behind the glamour. But even as we admire their accomplishments and mourn their loss, one question looms larger than all the rest. What forces, hidden from view, led to the events that would ultimately destroy the family they had spent decades building? And what came next would reveal layers of complexity and shock that no one could have anticipated. The secrets behind the Reiners' private world, and the truths about the son at the center of it all. Who was Nick Reiner, really? To the world, he was a name splashed across headlines, tied to the most shocking tragedy in Hollywood in decades. But behind the media frenzy and flashing cameras, Nick was a son, a brother, a private individual navigating a life that seemed enviable on the surface, yet carried hidden complexities few could understand. How does a person raised in privilege, nurtured by love, and surrounded by opportunity become the center of such devastation? That question lingered in every conversation, in every news report, and in every thought of those who knew the Reiner family personally. Nick was the youngest of the Reiners, growing up in the shadow of parents whose achievements were legendary. Rob Reiner's career in film and activism cast a long, unignorable light, and Michelle Reiner's artistic influence added another layer of expectation. In a household like this, the stakes were high. Every action, every decision, every perceived failure carried weight far beyond what most children experience. While older siblings may have carved their own paths and found ways to navigate the pressures of fame and expectation, Nick maintained a lower profile, quietly observing the world around him. But quietness does not equate to invisibility, especially not when you are the son of one of Hollywood's most celebrated figures. Those who knew Nick described him as intelligent and introspective. He was polite, reserved, and often thoughtful, someone who appeared calm on the surface. But for every calm exterior, there were glimpses of deeper struggles, moments of frustration, isolation, and inner conflict. Friends and acquaintances hint at a young man who wrestled with identity, autonomy, and expectations. Growing up in such a high-profile family can create pressure points that are invisible yet profound. When your parents are icons, your own achievements are constantly measured against theirs, and your mistakes are magnified by both familial and public scrutiny. It's important to remember, Nick was not a public figure. Unlike his father or even his mother's professional visibility, he did not seek fame or attention. He was educated, well-mannered, and largely stayed out of the spotlight. But isolation and private struggle are often breeding grounds for emotional turmoil. Could Nick have felt trapped, overlooked, or misunderstood within the very environment designed to nurture him? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the question is unavoidable, and it became a central point of both public fascination and investigative inquiry. Even as neighbors and friends recalled a seemingly ordinary young man, hints of tension appeared. Reports from those close to the family describe moments where Nick seemed withdrawn, frustrated, or disconnected. There were subtle signs of conflict, both internal and external, though nothing that suggested what was to come. Many of these details would later be scrutinized as experts tried to reconstruct the emotional landscape that led to the tragedy. Consider the pressures Nick faced. His father's reputation for brilliance and activism demanded high standards at every level. His mother's artistic achievements and meticulous nature added layers of expectation, particularly in matters of personal responsibility and discipline. Growing up in such an environment can shape a child's psyche in complex ways. Admiration mixed with anxiety, love mixed with obligation, freedom mixed with constraint. For Nick, navigating these tensions may have been an ongoing, invisible struggle. What about his relationships outside the family? Few people could speak in detail, but reports suggest that Nick maintained friendships, pursued interests, and attempted to forge a path that was his own. Yet in households dominated by public success and expectation, individuality can feel both liberating and burdensome. How do you balance personal desires with the weight of a legacy you didn't ask for but cannot escape? For some, that tension fosters growth. For others, it can fester, creating resentment or confusion. Nick's trajectory raises broader questions about children of high-profile parents. The public often assumes that wealth and opportunity guarantee happiness, yet the reality is more complicated. Privilege can shield from certain struggles while amplifying others. Isolation, public expectation, and family pressure can create invisible stressors that accumulate quietly over time. In Nick's case, the eventual breaking point came as a shock to everyone. Precisely because no one could reconcile his outward demeanor with the violence that later unfolded. Even among those closest to the Reiners, the image of Nick was contradictory. To some, he was calm and thoughtful. To others, he was private, perhaps secretive. Could it be that the son everyone thought they knew, the quiet, unassuming child of a famous couple, harbored emotions, thoughts, and tensions that went entirely unnoticed? It's a possibility that investigators would explore in painstaking detail. Nick's adolescence and early adulthood were relatively quiet in public records. He pursued education and seemingly ordinary pursuits, maintaining a level of detachment from Hollywood's spotlight. Yet psychological studies show that even subtle feelings of invisibility or comparison can intensify in high-pressure environments. Children of accomplished parents may struggle to define their own identity, leading to internal conflict, frustration, or a sense of inadequacy, even in the midst of apparent privilege. Friends and acquaintances later described Nick as someone with a keen intellect and creative curiosity, traits encouraged by both parents. Rob Reiner often spoke of nurturing critical thinking and perspective, while Michelle fostered artistic expression. Yet, even nurturing environments can have unintended consequences. A child who is constantly measured against high standards, or whose achievements are never entirely independent of parental legacy, may experience internal pressure that is difficult to articulate or resolve. What is perhaps most haunting is the disconnect between public perception and private reality. To the media, to fans, to Hollywood insiders, Nick was largely invisible, the quiet son of a prominent family. Yet that very invisibility may have concealed a complex, turbulent inner life, one that would later culminate in actions that shocked the world. The contrast between the son the public thought they knew and the events that unfolded is stark, almost cinematic, and yet entirely real. As investigators pieced together timelines, evidence, and personal history, a picture emerged of a man struggling under unseen pressures. Was there premeditation, or was this an emotional explosion triggered by a single event? What role did family dynamics, personal identity, and hidden grievances play? And how could a household that appeared so functional on the surface harbor the seeds of such devastation? Even the media acknowledged the difficulty of reconciling these truths. Commentators described Nick as polite, reserved, unassuming, a young man seemingly at ease with his life. Yet now, he was at the center of one of Hollywood's darkest stories, a paradox that confounded everyone. How could someone so quiet, so unremarkable in day-to-day behavior, be accused of such an extreme act? There are also human elements to consider. The reactions of siblings, friends, and distant relatives provide insight into the pressures and contradictions of the Reiner household. Stories surfaced of family expectations, discussions about the future, and subtle tensions that existed long before the tragedy. While these details don't excuse what happened, they illuminate the complexity of relationships within families, especially those navigating fame, legacy, and personal growth simultaneously. And then there is the chilling realization. Nick, the son who had always been somewhat invisible, became the focal point of global attention. Not for his achievements or character, but for an alleged act of violence so extreme it left everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. The son no one saw coming was now the son everyone was trying to understand, analyze, and, in some ways, fear. In many ways, Nick's story is a cautionary tale. It illustrates the pressures inherent in growing up with extraordinary parents, the challenges of balancing personal identity against familial expectation, and the tragic consequences when those pressures intersect with private struggles that go unaddressed. The tragedy of that Sunday in Brentwood is not only a story about a crime. It is a story about the fragility of human relationships, the hidden depths of emotional turmoil, and the unpredictable outcomes of unrecognized struggles. As we continue, the investigation into Nick's actions, motivations, and the circumstances surrounding the Reiner family's tragedy deepens. Witness accounts, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence begin to paint a picture of events that no one could have anticipated. Every new detail adds layers of complexity, tension, and emotional weight, challenging both investigators and the public to reconcile what they knew about Nick with what he allegedly did. And as these layers unfold, one unavoidable truth emerges: the son no one saw coming, the quiet, reserved youngest child of a celebrated family, is now the axis around which the entire story spins. But what came next would push the boundaries of disbelief even further, revealing motives, secrets, and revelations that would change the way the world viewed the Reiners forever. Have you ever walked past a home and thought, everything inside looks perfect? The manicured lawns, polished floors, art on the walls. Everything seems untouched, serene, and safe. But sometimes, appearances can be deadly misleading. That's exactly what police found when they entered the Reiner residence on that fateful Sunday afternoon in Brentwood. A house that once radiated creativity, love, and laughter had been transformed into a scene of horror, a place that would leave investigators shaken, neighbors stunned, and the world in disbelief. The Brentwood mansion was elegant and expansive, a reflection of Rob and Michelle Reiner's success and taste. Art adorned the walls, awards gleamed on shelves, and books lined the rooms, all symbols of a life steeped in intellect and creativity. To anyone walking in, it would have felt like entering a curated gallery of accomplishment and warmth. But beneath that calm surface, the devastating reality awaited. First responders who entered the home describe a scene that defied comprehension. The couple, Rob and Michelle, were found lifeless. Both had suffered fatal stab wounds. The circumstances were immediately shocking, not only for the violence itself, but for the stark contrast with the home's previously serene environment. Police were quick to secure the scene, cordoning off rooms and meticulously documenting every detail. The mansion, once a symbol of achievement and legacy, was now a crime scene saturated with grief, fear, and confusion. Neighbors gathered outside, their curiosity tinged with disbelief and horror. Many had interacted with the Reiners over the years, exchanging pleasantries on morning walks, attending neighborhood events, or witnessing family outings. Now, they stared at the flashing lights of police vehicles, the yellow tape, and the helicopters hovering above, trying to reconcile the image of the family they knew with the reality of the tragedy inside. How could such violence erupt in a home that seemed, until that day, inviolable? The initial reports from law enforcement were cautious but chilling. Detectives immediately suspected foul play, given the nature of the injuries and the absence of forced entry. Surveillance footage, combined with forensic evidence collected from the scene, would later point investigators toward a suspect who, remarkably, was already part of the household, Nick Reiner. But at this stage, the world did not yet know the full extent of what investigators had uncovered. The details trickled out slowly, each revelation more shocking than the last. Inside the mansion, investigators encountered a home that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that it contained the usual signs of family life: personal belongings, photographs, furniture arranged for comfort rather than display. Extraordinary because it belonged to a household known for brilliance and influence. The tension between the mundane and the extraordinary amplified the horror of the scene, making the tragedy feel even more surreal. The forensic teams worked with precision, cataloging every piece of evidence, from fingerprints and fibers to more subtle clues that could later inform motive and timeline. Each room was carefully examined for disturbances, each surface scrutinized for signs of struggle or conflict. The investigation revealed both the brutality of the act and the calculated steps that may have preceded it. Experts later described the scene as meticulous yet terrifying, a combination that suggested a level of planning, intention, or at least a moment of extreme focus and resolve. Even in these early hours, law enforcement recognized that this was no ordinary domestic incident. The fact that the suspect was a family member made the situation exponentially more complex. Officers and investigators had to balance forensic analysis with emotional sensitivity, navigating the horror of what had occurred while preserving every detail for the eventual legal proceedings. It was a delicate dance, one that required both technical skill and human empathy. The community's response was immediate and intense. Friends of the family, former colleagues, and local residents expressed shock and sorrow. Social media feeds filled with speculation, condolences, and disbelief. How could such a tragedy happen to a family that, from all outward appearances, had everything? The dichotomy between public perception and private. Even in these early hours, law enforcement recognized that this was no ordinary domestic incident. The fact that the suspect was a family member made the situation exponentially more complex. Officers and investigators had to balance forensic analysis with emotional sensitivity, navigating the horror of what had occurred while preserving every detail for the eventual legal proceedings. It was a delicate dance, one that required both technical skill and human empathy. The community's response was immediate and intense. Friends of the family, former colleagues, and local residents expressed shock and sorrow. Social media feeds filled with speculation, condolences, and disbelief. How could such a tragedy happen to a family that, from all outward appearances, had everything? The dichotomy between public perception and private reality became the focus of endless discussion, both in the press and in private conversations among those who knew the Reiners personally. Investigators also noted subtle but important details in the home: objects out of place, personal effects that seemed unusually disturbed, and certain patterns in the placement of evidence suggested a narrative that would take weeks to fully reconstruct. Each detail, while minor in isolation, contributed to a larger picture that investigators were only beginning to understand. The home itself told a story, a silent witness to the events that had unfolded within its walls. The crime scene also revealed emotional layers that went beyond the physical evidence. Family photographs, awards, and personal mementos, items meant to celebrate achievement and memory, now became haunting reminders of what had been lost. Every object seemed to carry a dual meaning, a celebration of life and a testament to death. Police officers and crime scene analysts later described the atmosphere as heavy, almost suffocating, a mixture of grief, shock, and disbelief that permeated every room. And then there was the question of motive, lurking silently in the background. Investigators began to piece together timelines, cross-referencing communications, surveillance footage, and personal interactions. While the crime scene provided physical evidence, it also raised new questions. Why this home? Why these victims? And how could the suspect, someone so intimately familiar with the household and its routines, have carried out such an act without immediate detection? The media coverage amplified these questions, often speculating wildly while attempting to maintain accuracy. Headlines highlighted both the brutality of the murders and the shocking involvement of Nick Reiner, the family's youngest son. Analysts debated potential psychological, financial, and relational factors that could have contributed to the tragedy. Public fascination grew not only because of the violence, but because of the incongruity. A seemingly loving family, a talented, well-regarded household, and a son who, on the surface, appeared ordinary, now at the center of one of Hollywood's darkest stories. Friends and colleagues of the Reiners offered fragmented insights. Some described Nick as reserved but kind, Others hinted at quiet frustrations or private struggles. These accounts, while anecdotal, added layers of complexity to the narrative. Could subtle tensions or unrecognized behavioral patterns have escalated into this catastrophic event? And if so, what signs had been missed and what pressures might have gone unnoticed? Inside the mansion, every corner seemed to whisper a story. From the kitchen where family meals had been shared to the study where Rob Reiner may have written scripts or letters. Each space bore traces of both life and violence. For investigators, these details were crucial. Evidence of sequence, intent, and perhaps even motive. For the public, they became a grim reflection on the fragility of human life, regardless of fame or fortune. Even as the investigation unfolded, the Reiner household became a symbol, a cautionary tale about appearances, a reminder that behind every smile and every accolade, there may exist unseen struggles and conflicts. The juxtaposition of the home's elegance with the horror discovered inside created a stark, almost surreal, narrative that captured the attention of not just Hollywood but the entire nation. And then came the detail that would shake both investigators and the public. Evidence suggesting that the person responsible, Nick Reiner, had intimate knowledge of the household. The precision and timing of the act, combined with the lack of forced entry, pointed to a tragic inevitability that few had considered until now. The crime scene itself, in all its meticulous detail, was a silent testament to the complexity of the events, the relationships involved, and the chilling reality of what had occurred. What made this discovery even more shocking was the realization that the son no one saw coming, the quiet, private youngest child, may have been acting out of a mixture of personal conflict, suppressed emotion, and circumstances that no one outside the household could fully understand. The physical evidence, combined with behavioral analysis, began to tell a story that was as fascinating as it was terrifying. A family's legacy, violently disrupted by the actions of its own kin. And so, the Brentwood mansion became both a crime scene and a narrative catalyst. Every detail, from objects disturbed to forensic evidence to the atmosphere of grief, contributed to a story that would dominate headlines for months to come. It was a stark reminder that even in homes filled with love, art, and achievement, darkness can lurk in ways no one anticipates. But what came next would reveal not only the motive behind the tragedy, but also secrets within the Reiner household that no one could have predicted. Details so shocking they would force Hollywood and the world to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about this family. Why would a son turn against the parents who gave him life, love, and opportunity? That question burned through every newsroom, every social media thread, and every conversation among those trying to make sense of the Reiner tragedy. On the surface, Nick Reiner had everything a young man could want. A stable upbringing, access to the finest education, the influence of his parents' legacy, and the safety of a family household filled with affection and opportunity. Yet the events of that fateful Sunday suggested something far darker beneath the polished surface. Investigators immediately focused on possible motives, and as they dug deeper, a labyrinth of potential explanations began to emerge. Some experts speculated that financial tensions could have played a role. The Reiner family had considerable wealth, accumulated over decades of filmmaking, activism, and creative endeavors. In families with substantial assets, disputes over inheritance or perceived favoritism can create rifts, sometimes invisible to outsiders, but profoundly felt by those within. Could money, or the pressure associated with it, have been a catalyst for the tragedy? Other analysts looked to psychological factors. Growing up in a household dominated by high-achieving parents can foster complex emotions in children. On one hand, there's pride and admiration. On the other, a weighty sense of expectation. Children often internalize these pressures, struggling to find identity and autonomy. Experts on family dynamics speculated that Nick may have harbored feelings of inadequacy, frustration, or resentment, emotions that, if left unaddressed, can manifest in dangerous ways. Was this tragedy an explosion of bottled-up emotion, or a more deliberate act fueled by a combination of factors? Even family insiders offered fragmented insights. Friends of the Reiners hinted at subtle tensions, though nothing that could predict violence. Nick was described as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, a young man who rarely sought attention, yet seemed thoughtful and intelligent. Were there moments when he felt misunderstood, overlooked, or overshadowed by his parents' fame? The answers are murky, but investigators considered every possibility, from long-standing personal grievances to recent triggers that might have precipitated the catastrophic event. The media also speculated about relational dynamics within the household. It's common in high-profile families for conflicts to remain private, shielded from public view. But even hidden conflicts can escalate. Were there disagreements about expectations, lifestyle choices, or personal freedoms? Could a combination of subtle resentments, unspoken conflicts, and emotional strain have reached a breaking point on that Sunday afternoon? These questions, though unanswerable at the time, fueled public fascination and intense speculation. Some experts suggested that mental health struggles may have played a role. While no official diagnosis was publicly confirmed, psychologists and behavior analysts emphasized that untreated or unrecognized mental health issues can exacerbate stress and impair judgment. In a household where public perception and legacy are paramount, acknowledging personal struggles can be difficult, even impossible. Could Nick have been silently struggling, his inner turmoil invisible to even those closest to him? Financial motives were also examined in detail. Investigators reviewed records, family trusts, and asset distribution. The Reiners' wealth was considerable, including investments, royalties, and properties. In some cases, disputes over inheritance or perceived favoritism among siblings can ignite tension. While no direct evidence immediately indicated a financial motive, the possibility was carefully considered alongside psychological and relational factors. Another dimension was external influence. Investigators explored whether outside pressures, relationships, or interactions may have contributed to Nick's state of mind. Was there an external individual or circumstance that acted as a catalyst? While initial reports focused on family dynamics, investigators did not rule out the influence of friends, acquaintances, or even online interactions. The question remained, was this a purely internal family issue, or were there external factors that tipped the balance? The complexity of motive is compounded by the contrast between Nick's public persona and the alleged act. To outsiders, he appeared polite, quiet, and unremarkable. Yet within hours, he became the focal point of a case that would dominate national headlines. The disparity between appearance and action created a paradox that both investigators and the public struggled to reconcile. How could someone so seemingly ordinary commit an act so extraordinary? In its horror, its intensity, and its betrayal, even as investigators gathered evidence, the family's private history became a central element in understanding potential motives. Sources hinted at disagreements, subtle tensions, and moments of conflict that, while normal in many households, may have accumulated over time. Experts on family dynamics emphasize that unresolved conflicts, when compounded by stress, mental health challenges, or perceived slights, can create conditions for catastrophic outcomes. The investigation also revealed small but telling details. Certain rooms had signs of recent activity, objects were displaced, and patterns suggested a familiarity with the household that only someone close could possess. These details hinted at premeditation, or at least a deliberate knowledge of the environment, a chilling confirmation that the alleged perpetrator was intimately familiar with both the space and its occupants. Public speculation was relentless. Social media was awash with theories, ranging from the plausible to the wildly improbable. Commentators debated everything from financial disputes to psychological triggers. News outlets revisited every known detail of Nick's upbringing, education, and personal life. Friends and colleagues were interviewed repeatedly, offering fragmentary insights into a young man whose outward demeanor masked complexities that only became visible in hindsight. Yet the motive remained elusive. Even as investigators pieced together the timeline and examined every available clue, the human element was impossible to fully quantify. Emotions, intentions, and inner thoughts, the very factors that drive human behavior, are notoriously difficult to measure. The story, therefore, became a mixture of hard evidence and speculative reconstruction, a blend of what happened and why it might have happened, both grounded in reality and shrouded in mystery. Forensic experts emphasized the significance of intent. First-degree murder charges indicated a level of premeditation or deliberation that distinguished this act from a spontaneous crime. Every movement, every action, every choice had to be scrutinized. The physical evidence suggested that this was not merely a moment of uncontrolled rage, but a calculated act, a conclusion that deepened the mystery. Why would someone plan an act against those who had given them life and love? Psychologists examining similar cases note that a combination of perceived pressure, emotional suppression, and unresolved conflict can create a volatile psychological environment. Even in families that appear stable, subtle tensions can compound over time. The Reiners, with their fame, success, and high expectations, may have inadvertently created pressures that were invisible to the outside world but deeply felt by the youngest son. Could a perfect storm of factors, internal conflict, perceived grievances, and emotional strain, have culminated in the tragedy? Neighbors and family friends reported small anomalies in behavior in the days leading up to the tragedy. Nick had been seen walking alone, distant and introspective, though nothing overtly alarming. Small hints, subtle behaviors, often overlooked, became pieces of a puzzle that investigators would later analyze in painstaking detail. Each fragment added weight to the notion that motive was complex, multifaceted, and perhaps impossible to summarize in a single explanation. And yet, even with all these considerations, the public remained obsessed with the why. The human need to assign cause, to make sense of senselessness. How could a family so revered, so accomplished, fall victim to such an unimaginable act? What secrets lay hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy? Were there warning signs, missed opportunities, or invisible fractures that, had they been addressed, might have prevented the tragedy? The reality is that motive, especially in cases of familial violence, is rarely simple. It is a tangle of emotion, circumstance, personality, and environment. In the case of the Reiners, the combination of fame, wealth, expectation, and psychological dynamics created a pressure cooker environment, one that exploded in a way that no one, not even those closest to the family, could have anticipated. And as the investigation continued, new details began to emerge. Friends recalled arguments, subtle shifts in behavior, and minor disputes that, in isolation, seemed inconsequential. But collectively, they painted a picture of a family dynamic that was more complicated than anyone had realized. Every nuance, every hidden tension, became a potential clue in the search for understanding. The motive, while never entirely clear, became a mix of mystery, speculation, and partially confirmed details. It was a blend of familial tension, psychological pressure, potential financial concerns, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Each element alone could not explain the tragedy. Together, they offered a glimpse into a storm that had been quietly brewing, one that would ultimately destroy a family in a single, catastrophic day. But what came next would reveal the exact moments, the interactions, and the shocking evidence that tied Nick Reiner directly to the Reiner tragedy. Details so disturbing and precise that the world would be forced to confront a reality stranger and more horrifying than fiction. How do you catch a killer when the suspect is someone you thought you knew? Someone from within the very walls of the crime scene. For the Los Angeles Police Department, this was not just another homicide. It was a high-profile, emotionally charged investigation that combined family dynamics, celebrity scrutiny, and the challenge of connecting dots in a house already steeped in tragedy. Every step mattered, every detail could be pivotal, and every minute heightened the pressure to solve a case that had captivated a city and a nation. The investigation began the moment police were called to the Reiner residence. Officers arrived to find a home transformed from a sanctuary into a crime scene, a place filled with the echoes of life, now silenced by violence. Initial observations suggested foul play, and investigators immediately understood the gravity of the situation. The victims were well known, the suspect was likely known to them, and the public scrutiny would be immense. Detectives approached the scene with meticulous precision. Every corner of the Brentwood mansion was examined, documented, and preserved. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, collecting fingerprints, fibers, and other physical evidence that could provide crucial insights. They analyzed entry points, points of contact, and the patterns of disturbance throughout the house. While to the untrained eye these might seem like mere details, each piece of evidence was a clue in reconstructing not only the events but the intent behind them. It quickly became apparent that the suspect was someone intimately familiar with the household. There was no forced entry, no signs of burglary, and no evidence suggesting a random attack. This realization dramatically narrowed the scope of the investigation, focusing attention on individuals close to the family. The ones who had routine access, who knew the layout, and who understood the rhythms of daily life in the Reiner home. Simultaneously, law enforcement began interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. Witnesses described minor details: a car parked differently, a person walking near the home at odd hours, a delivery noticed but not questioned at the time. All of which would later form a mosaic of movement and timing essential to the investigation. Each lead was carefully corroborated and cataloged, ensuring that no potential detail was overlooked. Digital forensics played a significant role as well. Investigators analyzed phone records, emails, and other communications to determine who had been in contact with the Reiners in the days leading up to the tragedy. Surveillance footage from both the neighborhood and nearby streets was meticulously reviewed. Small, almost imperceptible details, the timing of a car leaving the driveway, a figure moving in and out of frame, became crucial pieces of the puzzle. These details, when combined, began to outline a timeline that investigators would later use to determine not just opportunity, but potential motive. The investigation was intense, high pressure, and highly coordinated. Detectives had to balance the urgency of solving the crime with the sensitivity required for a case involving a family already grieving and a suspect who was part of that family. Every statement, every observation, and every piece of evidence was scrutinized for consistency, accuracy, and relevance. Nothing could be assumed. Everything had to be verified. It was during this meticulous process that law enforcement began to focus on Nick Reiner. His presence in the area at critical times, combined with behavioral observations and digital footprints, raised questions that investigators could not ignore.